The world knew Ace Frehley as the Space Ace, the silver-faced guitar hero who made Kiss's pyrotechnic spectacles come alive with his Les Paul magic. But on 1982, in front of 100,000 screaming fans at Maracanã Stadium in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, something happened that would tear the fabric of rock's greatest theatrical act apart forever. Gene Simmons, the demon himself, the man who breathed fire and spat blood for the audience's entertainment, did something he had never done in 9 years of relentless touring. He stopped playing mid-song, ripped off his bass guitar, threw it across the stage, and walked directly into the wings, leaving the band to collapse in front of the largest crowd they had ever faced. The spotlights kept burning, the pyrotechnics kept exploding, but the machine that was Kiss had just suffered a catastrophic malfunction. And at the center of this disaster stood Ace Frehley, guitar hanging loose from his shoulders, a Jack Daniels bottle at his feet, and a smile that nobody could quite understand. If you want to discover the untold stories behind rock's greatest legends and the moments that changed music history forever, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. Because what happened that night in Rio was not just a concert gone wrong. It was the culmination of years of hidden tensions, secret studio sessions, and a battle for identity that had been brewing since the moment Ace Frehley first painted that silver stardust across his face. To understand what exploded on that Brazilian stage in 1982, you have to go back to 1973, to a cramped rehearsal space in Manhattan where 4 struggling musicians were about to make a decision that would define and ultimately destroy them. Paul Daniel Frehley, a kid from the Bronx with calloused fingers and a Les Paul guitar that was worth more than everything else he owned, walked into that audition with no idea that he was about to disappear. Not physically, but in every way that mattered. The man who entered that room as Paul Frehley would exit as Space Ace, a character who would eventually consume every aspect of his identity until he no longer knew where the makeup ended and the real person began. Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley had a vision that was almost militaristic in its precision. They were not creating a band. They were engineering a phenomenon, a spectacle that would transcend music and become pure mythology. Each member would adopt a persona, a theatrical character that audiences could worship from a distance. Gene would be the demon, breathing fire and terrorizing the stage. Paul would be the star child, the romantic frontman. Peter Criss would be the catman, wild and unpredictable. And Ace would be the Space Ace, the cool, mysterious alien who let his guitar do all the talking. In those early years, the transformation felt like liberation. Ace was painfully shy, uncomfortable with attention, awkward in interviews, but behind that silver makeup, with those black stars painted across his eyes, he could become someone else entirely. The stage fright disappeared. The insecurity vanished. Space Ace could walk out in front of 20,000 people and own every second of it. The character was a shield, a protective barrier between the vulnerable kid from the Bronx and the terrifying reality of sudden fame. But shields can become prisons, and nobody understood that better than Ace Frehley as the 1970s progressed and Kiss transformed from a struggling club act into the biggest rock phenomenon in the world. The drinking started as a social thing, as it always does. A beer after the show to come down from the adrenaline high. A shot of whiskey before going on stage to calm the nerves. But by 1977, during the exhausting Love Gun tour that saw Kiss playing sold-out arenas across America night after night, Ace was drinking to forget. Not to celebrate, not to relax, but to temporarily erase the growing sense that he had made a terrible mistake, that the character he created had become a monster devouring him from the inside out. Gene Simmons noticed it first. Gene always noticed everything. He was the businessman of Kiss, the one who understood that the band was not just a musical act, but a brand, a commercial empire, and what Gene saw terrified him. Ace was becoming unreliable, missing sound checks, showing up to recording sessions hours late, playing sloppily during concerts. But what really concerned Gene was something subtler. Ace was becoming creatively restless. In band meetings, when they discussed new albums, Ace would suggest musical directions that didn't fit the Kiss formula. He wanted to experiment with different guitar tones, to write songs that explored themes beyond the party anthems that had made them famous. And every time Gene and Paul would shut him down. "This is not what Kiss does," they would say. "Stick to the formula. Stay in character." So Ace did something nobody expected. In late 1977, he started making secret plans. The record label proposed that each Kiss member release their own solo album, all on the same day. Gene and Paul loved the idea, seeing it as another Kiss product, another revenue stream. They assumed their albums would be the commercial successes. And Ace? Well, Ace would make some noise, show off his guitar skills, and then they would all get back to the real work of being Kiss. But Ace saw the solo album project as something entirely different. It was a chance to finally, after years of being trapped behind the Space Ace character, to show the world who Paul Daniel Frehley actually was as a musician. He started working in secret, late-night sessions at Plaza Sound Studios in Manhattan, recording songs that had been living in his head for years, but had never fit the Kiss template. The problem was that he was still drinking heavily. The recording sessions would start at midnight and run until dawn, with Ace consuming an entire bottle of Jack Daniels over the course of the night. And then something happened that nobody could have predicted. Ace's solo album, released on September 18, 1978, became the biggest commercial success of all 4 Kiss solo records. While Gene's and Paul's albums received mixed reviews and modest sales, Ace's album went platinum. The lead single, New York Groove, became a top 20 hit. Critics who had always dismissed Kiss as theatrical nonsense praised Ace's album for its musicianship, its genuine emotion, its raw rock and roll energy. For the first time in 5 years, Ace Frehley was being recognized not as Space Ace, not as 1/4 of the Kiss brand, but as an individual artist with legitimate talent. And that recognition felt better than anything he had experienced on the biggest Kiss stages. It felt like validation. It felt like freedom. It felt like he had finally found a way out of the prison he had built for himself. But it also destroyed whatever fragile peace had existed within Kiss. Because Gene and Paul could accept a lot of things. They could accept Ace's drinking, his unreliability, his increasing isolation. But they could not accept being overshadowed. They could not accept that Ace had just proven he didn't need them. The relationship deteriorated rapidly after the solo albums. On the surface, they maintained the facade. They toured together, promoted Dynasty, smiled for photographers. But backstage, the tensions were impossible to ignore. Gene and Paul started making decisions without consulting Ace and Peter. They brought in outside songwriters, session musicians to replace Ace's guitar parts when he was too drunk to record them properly. They started talking openly about replacing Peter entirely. Ace responded by drinking more. The Jack Daniels that had been an occasional companion became his constant shadow. He would start drinking in the afternoon before shows, continue throughout the performance, and then rage through the night. The hangovers became so severe that he started using pills to wake up and pills to come down, a pharmaceutical cocktail that kept him functioning just barely enough to make it through each day. The music suffered. There were concerts where Ace could barely remember chord progressions to songs he had played thousands of times. Shows where he would stumble across the stage, moments where his fingers would slip off the frets mid-solo, creating jarring mistakes that shattered the Kiss illusion of perfect theatrical precision. Gene would glare at him. Paul would shoot him looks of pure disgust. And Ace would just smile that disconnected smile, the one that said he was somewhere far away. The crisis point came in Albany, New York, in October of 1980. Kiss was playing mid-sized venues instead of the massive stadiums they had sold out just 3 years earlier. On this particular night, Ace was worse than anyone had ever seen him. He had been drinking since noon, mixing whiskey with prescription pills. By the time Kiss took the stage, Ace was barely conscious. He made it through 3 songs. Then, during Shock Me, his signature song, Ace stopped playing entirely. Just stood there, guitar hanging from his neck, staring out at the audience with unfocused eyes. And then Ace turned, walked off the stage in the middle of the song, and collapsed in the wings. The roadies found him 15 minutes later, unconscious in a puddle of his own vomit. They called an ambulance. Ace was rushed to Albany Medical Center, where doctors pumped his stomach. It was alcohol poisoning combined with benzodiazepines, a mixture that could have easily stopped his heart. When Ace finally woke up the next afternoon, there was only one person sitting beside his hospital bed. Not Gene Simmons, not Paul Stanley, not Peter Criss. A young roadie named Danny, someone Ace barely knew. Danny didn't say much, just sat there keeping watch. And when Ace's eyes finally opened, Danny leaned forward and said words that would stay with Ace forever. "You're killing yourself for people who don't care if you live or die. Is the makeup really worth it?" That question haunted Ace through his recovery, through the remainder of the tour, through recording sessions for the next album. Gene and Paul never visited him in the hospital, never called to check on him. When he rejoined the tour 3 weeks later, they acted like nothing had happened. The Space Ace character went back on, the silver makeup was reapplied, and the show continued. But something had fundamentally broken inside Ace Frehley, and that break would reach its explosive conclusion on a stage in Rio de Janeiro just 14 months later. The 1982 South American tour was supposed to be Kiss's triumphant return to international superstardom. They had just released Creatures of the Night, their heaviest record in years. The album was getting strong reviews, and the final show at Rio's massive Maracanã Stadium was going to be the biggest concert in Kiss history. 100,000 tickets sold. Press from around the world. A performance that would be filmed and recorded for a potential live album. This was their chance to prove they were still relevant, still powerful, still the greatest rock and roll spectacle on Earth. But Ace didn't want to be there. By this point, he had already made the decision to leave Kiss, though he hadn't officially told Gene and Paul yet. He was going through the motions, playing the shows, wearing the costume, but his heart had completely checked out. And on the day of the Rio concert, he started drinking at breakfast and never stopped. By the time Kiss was scheduled to take the stage at 9 p.m., Ace was as drunk as anyone had ever seen him, swaying on his feet backstage, barely able to hold his guitar. Gene confronted him 15 minutes before showtime. Witnesses backstage reported hearing Gene's voice rising, furious, demanding to know if Ace was going to be able to perform. Ace just laughed, a hollow sound that contained no humor whatsoever. Then he walked past Gene, past Paul, past the stage managers frantically preparing for the biggest show of their careers, and stepped out into the Brazilian heat where 100,000 people were screaming for Kiss. The first few songs went surprisingly well. Ace was sloppy, missing cues and playing incorrect notes, but the sheer volume and chaos of the Kiss production masked most of his mistakes. The pyrotechnics exploded on time. Gene breathed fire. Paul worked the crowd, and Ace stood in his spot on stage right, playing his Les Paul with mechanical precision, going through the motions without any genuine presence or energy. But then came Cold Gin, a song that Ace had written back in the early Kiss days, one of the few tracks in the catalog that was purely his creation. This was the moment where Ace usually came alive, where he delivered a guitar solo that reminded everyone why he was considered one of the great rock guitarists of his generation. The song started normally. Gene began singing. The crowd responded enthusiastically, and then the spotlight swung to Ace for his solo, and Ace did nothing. He just stood there, guitar in his hands, staring out at the massive sea of people. The backing track continued playing. Gene and Paul exchanged confused glances. The crew watched in growing horror. 30 seconds passed. 45. A full minute of dead air where Ace Frehley was supposed to be playing, but instead was simply standing motionless. Finally, Ace started playing. But it wasn't the Cold Gin solo. It was something else entirely. A slow, bluesy improvisation that had nothing to do with the song. Nothing to do with what Kiss was supposed to sound like. It was beautiful in a way, raw and emotional and genuine. But it was also completely wrong, a jarring disruption of the carefully choreographed Kiss machine. Paul tried to bring the song back on track. Gene moved closer to Ace, trying to get his attention. But Ace kept playing his blues solo, tears visible on his face beneath the silver makeup, completely disconnected from everything happening around him. And that's when Gene Simmons snapped. He stopped playing his bass mid-song, a cardinal sin in the Kiss playbook where the show must always continue no matter what happens. He ripped the instrument from around his neck and threw it across the stage, where it landed with a crash of feedback that echoed through the stadium. Then he pointed at Ace, said something lost in the noise, and walked directly off the stage, leaving 100,000 confused fans and the remains of Kiss to figure out what just happened. Paul and Peter tried to keep going. They launched into Rock and Roll All Night, The Closer, the anthem. But without Gene, without the full lineup, the performance felt hollow and desperate. Ace eventually started playing the correct chords, but there was no energy, no life. The crowd, sensing something was deeply wrong, began to boo. Debris was thrown onto the stage, and when the final pyrotechnic explosion went off and the house lights came up, nobody felt like they had just witnessed rock history. They felt like they had watched something die. Backstage after the show, Gene and Ace didn't speak. They didn't even look at each other. Gene went straight to his dressing room and locked the door. Paul handled the press, making excuses about technical difficulties. The Kiss organization went into damage control mode, ensuring that footage of Gene's stage exit would never see official release, that the narrative could be controlled to protect the brand. 3 months later, Ace officially left Kiss. The public announcement was carefully worded, talking about creative differences and solo projects. Gene and Paul did interviews praising Ace's contributions, while making it clear they were excited to move forward with a new lineup. Ace himself remained largely silent, disappearing into a haze of alcohol and pills that would consume the next several years of his life. For decades, the Rio incident remained a footnote in Kiss history, a story that hardcore fans discussed, but that never received official acknowledgement. Gene and Paul successfully buried it, focusing public attention on Kiss's continued success with replacement guitarists. But in 2018, during promotion of his autobiography, Ace finally told the complete truth. In a lengthy interview that stunned longtime Kiss fans, he revealed what had been going through his mind on that Rio stage, why he played that blues solo instead of the expected guitar part. He explained that he was saying goodbye, not just to Kiss, but to the Space Ace character, to the persona that had protected and imprisoned him for 9 years. That improvised solo was Paul Daniel Frehley, the kid from the Bronx who loved blues guitar, breaking through the makeup and the theatrics one final time. And Gene's reaction? That wasn't about Ace's performance. It was about control. Gene Simmons had built Kiss on absolute discipline, on the idea that individual expression must always be subordinate to the brand. And in that moment, watching Ace play whatever he wanted, ignoring the script, breaking the illusion, Gene realized that he had lost. That Ace had found a way to win, to reclaim his identity, even if it meant destroying his career in Kiss. The most surprising revelation came when Ace discussed what Gene told him 2 weeks after Rio, during the private meeting where they finalized his departure. Gene admitted that he respected what Ace had done, that it took courage to sabotage yourself that completely, to choose artistic integrity over commercial success. But he also made it clear that there was no path forward for them together, that Kiss required total commitment to the character, to the brand, and that Ace could never give that again. The Rio disaster became a watershed moment in rock history, though it took years for people to understand its significance. For Ace, the aftermath was brutal. He spent years struggling with addiction, releasing solo albums that received critical praise but minimal commercial success. There were arrests, health scares, financial troubles. But slowly, Ace began to find himself. Without the pressure of being in Kiss, without Gene and Paul's controlling presence, he rediscovered why he fell in love with guitar in the first place. His playing became more expressive, less concerned with technical flash, and more focused on emotional authenticity. Today, at 73 years old, Ace Frehley continues to tour and record, playing small clubs and theaters, connecting with audiences who appreciate authentic rock and roll. He doesn't wear the Space Ace makeup anymore except for special occasions. He doesn't need to. The character served its purpose, protected him when he was too young and insecure to face fame without a mask. But that night in Rio, when Gene Simmons walked off the stage in disgust and 100,000 fans watched Kiss implode, was the moment when Ace finally chose himself over the illusion. And that choice, as painful and destructive as it seemed at the time, was the first step toward becoming the artist he was always meant to be. The full truth about what happened on that Brazilian stage may never be completely known. Memories fade, stories change with each telling. But what remains undeniable is that the Rio incident marked the end of an era, the moment when one of rock's greatest theatrical acts revealed the human beings behind the makeup. And in that moment of vulnerability, of raw, authentic chaos, Ace Frehley gave the most real performance of his entire Kiss career. Not Space Ace, not a character, just a man who had finally had enough of being someone else.